Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have my very special guest, Mark Leyba, former message believer and leadership facilitator and coach. Mark, it's so good to have you on here. We've known each other for, I don't even know how many years it's been now, through the support groups, and you and I have spoken offline several times, or online, I should say, through the various chat messages, etc. Very good to see you in person for the first time, and I'm very excited to hear your story today.
Well, thank you, John. It's really an honor to be here. Before I jump into my story, I just want to take a moment to thank you for all of the hard work and the diligence and even the persecution you've received for uncovering everything you've uncovered about William Branham. I wish that research would have been available, years ago, for all of us people who had questions about Branham and the message and so on. So thank you. You have done such an incredible service that I know will live on for generations.
Thank you for the encouragement. It is quite a bit of persecution, as you can imagine.
Well, my goodness, I just can't imagine. And I consider myself kind of I was a lower level message believer. You're from message royalty. You came from a very high profile name in the message, and and that's one thing we all share to some degree is the persecution we received and the banishment and the treatment from making the choice to leave a toxic environment, a cult.
Absolutely. Well, you've got quite an interesting story, and I think before we get into that, it might be good just to take a minute and tell everyone a little bit about yourself. I know you, obviously, but tell the others, who you are, what you do, and what is your connection to the message, and let's go from there.
Sure. Well, my name is Mark Leyba. I am a resident of Denver, Colorado. I have deep roots in southern Colorado, northern New Mexico. My wife is an amateur genealogist, so we've been able to trace my line to the early Spanish colonists and the Pueblo natives. How I got in the message, that's why we're here, right? To talk about that. So right now, I've been out of the message for, close to 40 years. I work part-time. I'm semi-retired. I work part-time as a leadership facilitator and coach. I work for a government entity. That's most of my career has been in government, state government and county government. I also do work with nonprofits. I do a lot of work with a personality profile called the Enneagram. The Enneagram actually was really helpful for me in just understanding the dynamics, the personality dynamics of all the people in my life, my family, people who were in the message, and so on. So that's basically the short version of who I am.
As I understand it, you weren't raised in the message, and so your perspective is a little bit different than mine, who, like you said, I was cult royalty. I'm one of the oddballs who was raised to believe this from birth. So it might be interesting for the listeners to hear a little bit about what that's like. What's it like being raised in something else? How were you raised, and how did the shift and transition happen?
Sure. So, being a Hispanic family from Colorado, just like a lot of Hispanic families in this area, I was raised as Catholic. But my mom had she had a difficult time with the Catholic Church, mostly because of the situation that happened with my middle brother. So she left the church, when my brother was probably first or second grade. What had happened, and you talk about a cultic influence. I mean, my brother was left-handed, and when he was at first or second grade, the teacher, who was a nun, tried to force him to write with his right hand, and told him that left-handedness was of the devil. And my brother, being just a little boy and terrified of the nuns and feeling that he was maybe of the devil, didn't tell my parents any of this. But he developed this nervous twitch that my parents noticed. So finally, a little girl that had come over told my mom what the nun was doing. And my mom confronted the nun. And the nun basically said, well, Mrs. Leyba, this is what we believe. If you don't like it, you can leave. and my mom took him out of the school, put him in a public school, and she had a very tenuous relationship with the Catholic Church since then. Her sisters were still very staunch Catholics. When I came along, so I had two brothers. My oldest brother was 16 years older than me, and my middle brother was 11 years older. When I came along, they from the pressure from her sisters, they kind of pressured my mom to have me get my first communion. But after that, she pretty much didn't want to have anything to do with the Catholic Church. In fact, I don't know what her influences were, but I have her old Bible. And in Revelation, I think it's 13, this part about the great whore of Babylon, she has written in the side Catholic Church. So my mom looked, she searched, she was, she had a lot of her own demons that she had to deal with. She had a very difficult life. She had polio when she was 2. Her mother and her aunt, they were sex workers, and she was raised by her grandmother. Her grandmother's name was Leyba, and I have Leyba on both sides of the family. When I was a kid and I asked my mom about that, my mom had a great sense of humor. She said, "Yeah, Hito, that's why you and your brothers didn't turn out quite right. You've got that Leyba on both sides." Well, anyway, my mom had gotten an illness too later on when I was younger. She got cancer, and she also got a prescription drug addiction. So she struggled a lot, and she was a very loving, kind woman, but the drug addiction changed her in a lot of ways, and there was an aspect of her personality that was very, very difficult to deal with. She put the family through quite a bit, but she still was trying to find her path. So she checked out the Jehovah's Witnesses. She checked out the Mormons. I remember going with her to a Mormon church and actually really liking it because there was that sense of order, that sense of family. There was that sense of connection. Gee, John, I could have been following a different false prophet, right? But when we probably would have become Mormons, but when she talked to my dad, and my dad didn't go with her, he kind of followed along, kind of letting her do what she wanted. And he was, "I don't care. You want to become a Mormon, that's fine." But then she told him, "Well, they want 10% of your earnings." He said, "Hell no, this isn't going to happen." So she ended up going to a Pentecostal church for a while, and that kind of stuck for a little bit. But my mom would get easily offended at things, and then when she got offended, she was like out of there. He made some kind of comment about our ethnicity. I think what he had said was, he said, "Mrs. Leyba, I think it's interesting that you and your husband don't have that Spanish brogue that they didn't talk with an accent." So it offended her. She left, and that was kind of it with my religious experience with my mom. Then what had happened was, so I mentioned I had 2 brothers. So my oldest brother was he was a jazz musician, and he'd gotten in a lot of trouble with the law, and he'd had his difficulties too, and he wanted to clean up his life and start a new path. So he moved to California. So in California, he started going to, I think it was a full gospel church of some kind. And I think the reason he started going was he started first sending his children there. And at one point, one of his kids said, "Daddy, when are you and Mom going to start coming to church with us?" So he felt guilty and he started going. And he ended up becoming a born-again Christian. So he started conversing with my mother again about God and about religion. And, my mom started getting religious again. He started sending me stuff. I wasn't that interested at the time. I was like 14. But he sent me a New Testament. So I didn't think much of it until my mom passed away. And she passed away the only time I ever had the opportunity to go to church with her, the day after. So we went to church that evening, and then she passed away the next day. So it was through that I became a born-again Christian. And that's where my spiritual journey started. My brother Richard went back to California, and we would converse. So I started going to, full gospel types of churches at that point.
You mentioned your brother's left-handedness, which is the superstitions in these religions just fascinate me to no end, because when you think about, the Bible and Christianity. Superstition isn't something that you're supposed to be mixing in this, right?
I know, right? Right?
Yeah. And see, I share with your brother in the fact that I'm left-handed, but
Sure.
I don't know if it was superstition or just because I was different, I was encouraged to be right-handed. And so most everything I do is right-handed. And I'll never forget this. I was in, I think, third grade, and I may have mentioned this in the podcast before, but my teacher in elementary school was telling the class, explaining how the brain works, and they said if you use left-handed people are more apt to become inclined to music and art, etc. Everything that I wanted to do. And here I am writing right-handed, and at that time I was predominantly right-handed because I had done everything right-handed. Well, I decided that moment I'm going to learn to write with my left hand. And so I would write sentences with both hands at the same time. And over time, I got to where I could draw. I'm a cartoon artist. I used to draw Batman equally with two pieces of paper, two pencils, and they would look exactly the same. But the superstitions, just like I said, it fascinates me. Being cult royalty, I also had access to people and their private lives that other people did not see, and I can't give their names because they're still alive, but there are high-ranking people in this cult who they've got books on like the Zodiac, and they're big into the studying what is your horoscope and all of this stuff, which, growing up, I never thought about it because these are respected people that I know who are like, I looked up to these people. And then once I got out of that and we started attending other churches, and I started thinking about it, that's just really odd. Why the horoscopes?
Right. Yeah, it's really fascinating how it's in some ways people have these secret parts of their life that nobody really knows about. I think that applies to a lot of people.
Yeah.
So to continue on with my journey, so for a couple of years there, and I really looked up to my brother. He was my mentor. So my father was a house painter, and he learned his trade coming out in the Navy, and then he came out and joined the Painters Union, and he taught me and my two brothers that trade. That was my first profession. And my oldest brother taught me a lot, probably more than even my dad did, taught me a lot about that profession. And he introduced me to Christianity, and he introduced me to a lot of things. And he was my support system. My dad never really got involved in the cult. He never really got involved in any kind of a religion. He kind of just stood back and watched what was happening. So I would call my brother, and he would give me, inspiration. He'd send me all sorts of things that he was into. So he'd send me books by these full gospel people like Kenneth Hagin and Derek Prince and Bob Mumford, and I just devoured them. And I was just a teenager, just a kid. So then at one point he had told me, he said, he called me Marky. He said, Marky, he said, I'm going to send you some stuff that I want you to read that the Lord's been showing me. And I want you just to really have an open mind about it. And I said, sure, no problem. So he sent me these two tracks first. So he knew, and my brother was very charismatic. He was actually a really good preacher. He was very charming. He had a really a good way of connecting with people. So, he took it slow with me to introduce me to the message. So he sent me this first track on the Godhead. And I read it and I thought, well, kind of makes sense. I wasn't, because I was so young, I wasn't so steeped into the Trinitarian theology. And I thought, well, this kind of makes sense. So, I kind of accepted that. And then he sent me a serpent seed track. And when I read that, I thought my brother had completely lost his marbles. And at the time, I had a girlfriend who eventually became my wife. I showed her this, and, we were going to, different Christian churches here and there in Denver. And I just told her, I said, I think this is crazy. I said, I don't know what got into it to my brother, why he believes this. So I called him on the phone, and he said, Mark, this is from this man. I believe he's a prophet. And then he started telling me the story. So my brother was introduced to the message in California, right? Of all places, the place that's supposed to eventually, according to Branham, fall into the ocean. What had happened with my brother was he was attending this full gospel church of some kind. And this itinerant preacher shows up there just as a participant. Just as not in part of the church, but he was just kind of coming in and going. And he started talking to my brother about Branham. And at first, my brother was very resistant to it. And eventually, and this guy's, I'm sure he's long dead because he was 60 in the 60s back then. His name was Forrest Nanny, and he eventually convinced my brother that the message was correct. So my brother told me this whole story, and my brother had a way of telling stories that were very dramatic, and he had a very way of influencing people. So he said, I'm going to send you some books about Brother Branham and his ministry. So he sent me A Man Sent from God and the Seven Church Ages book. And I got them, and I just completely devoured them. And then I, too, started to believe in the message. So that's how my message journey started.
You mentioned the serpent seed, and I'm a little interested to hear about your perspective of that. See, and I'm certain that it was the same for you. We weren't told that this was a racist doctrine or where it came from. And
exactly,
it wasn't until, years later, I discover, no, this was the core of the racist theology, Christian identity, right? And I've been, as you know, I'm studying the white supremacy history of the United States.
Exactly.
It really didn't click with me. I know I'd read it before, but it didn't click until, I guess it was last year, that when white supremacy spread throughout the United States, there were different flavors of it. And the agendas were different for the varying groups. So you had, in the South, where you had the problem with, after the Civil War, the people with black skin were highly oppressed, and white supremacy rose up to be elitist over those people. Well, you get up north, and the biggest threat in Indiana were the Catholics. And so the Klan rose up against the Catholics. And out west, interestingly, I'm learning, I think it was just last week, I learned there were Klan groups that were anti-Mexican. And I didn't even know they're supposed to be anti-black, some of them. So,
wow, interesting.
Yeah, growing up in this thing, I did not realize, we had the hybriding doctrine where if you are an African American, you're not supposed to mate with a white person. They explicitly state that. And in the Southern churches, I grew up with that belief. And it never really clicked until I read this last week that there were churches I went to out west where it was the same. A Hispanic person could not marry a white person. Did you experience that at all in the groups that you...
Well, what's interesting, because I remember when I was really questioning, and the things that coming into the message, not being brought up into the message, there were some things that Branham said that didn't set right with me. And the thing that he said about against interracial marriage really bothered me. And I remember even talking to my brother, because we both married white women, right? My girlfriend was white. We got married. His wife's white. And I said, well, why wouldn't that apply to us too? That would he be against our marriages because we're Hispanic and we married Anglo women? And he had a way of explaining it, and I don't even remember exactly what he said, but in his perspective, it didn't apply. So, it's a really good point, though. It was definitely taught that black people should not marry white people, but not when it came to Hispanics, there was kind of a gray area. So that's kind of and then reading my perspective of the serpent seed is I had no clue that it was a racist kind of a message. I did remember, though, that the Mormons had a teaching about Cain and Abel and about the mark on Cain's head, and that was, being black, and how racist that was. So, I never really saw the connection early on. I never made that connection early on. Once I started, and Bridget started sending me tapes and message books and so on, there was and I don't remember what they call it in the message now, but a revival of some kind of a big meeting that was going to go on in Flagstaff, Arizona in 1975. And I was a junior in high school. So I talked my dad to let me go, and I had convinced a friend of mine who had introduced to Christianity, and he'd become a born-again Christian. We went to school together, and I also convinced him of the message. So we drove out in my car both. He was about a year older than I was, so he was like a senior in high school and I was a junior, to meet my brother to attend this big camp meeting. I mean, what did they call those meetings? Were they camp meetings or revivals, or I don't even remember, John.
It's different for different sects and groups.
Yeah.
But usually it's just like a gathering, or we're having special meetings is the phrase I've used.
Yeah,
I've heard the most. Special meetings.
Right. Yeah. So, and my brother said, well, Brother Branham's son will be there, Billy Paul. And we were really excited. And it was interesting because we hadn't fully grasped the what's the word I'm looking for? Just how harsh it was in the expectation. So my friend and I both had long hair. I had hair over my ears, and he had hair down to his neck. And we didn't really realize that was a no-no in message churches. So, we got there, and we actually, my brother was camping, so we all camped out. I don't remember how many days this was, but people looked at us kind of suspiciously because, we didn't really fit in. But of course, my brother and this guy, this minister that had introduced my brother to the message was there. And I don't remember all of what was taught, but I do remember a couple things that stood out to me. One, this was 1975. One was they were really pressing 77 as the year the rapture was supposed to happen. That, it wasn't, I don't remember how they termed it, but it's a pretty, maybe not a prophecy, but it's a pretty sure thing that's probably going to happen in 77. Yeah, and then the other thing they talked about, and I remember hearing Billy Paul Branham talk about this, about California falling into the ocean, and him saying, because it scared the crap out of me. He said, because my brother lived there in California. He said, my dad said that before I'm an old man, California's going to fall into the ocean, and I'm 39. I'm going to have my 40th birthday next year. And he said, my dad also said that you're an old man when you turn 40. So it's like we're thinking this is all going to start happening. The feces is going to hit the oscillating device, and boy, it's going to be tough. So
I like how you put that phrase. I'm going to have to use that.
Well, I know there's a lot of religious people that maybe the real term might offend them. So,
yeah.
I went back to Colorado. Richard went back to California with the intention of moving because, he wanted to get away before California fell into the ocean. And I went back and cleaned up my act, got a haircut, and, my wife started. We were still in high school. And we found out, my brother found out that there was a message church in Denver already. It was a home church. So my wife and I, my girlfriend at the time, we started attending this church. And the minister there, his name was Ken Southworth. And he is a very small church. And the thing that I thought was really interesting initially, and I caught on this right away, was how all the men kind of dressed the same. They all had cowboy hats and cowboy boots, and, they all ate like cherry pie with molasses. And it's like they were kind of like becoming little Branhams. And so we went there, and Southworth was actually very kind to us, and another kind of an interesting thing happened there too. There was another young man who was going there about my age I met. We ended up becoming really close friends. And he was associated with another church in the Midwest that we later on started becoming a message church that we later on became associated with too. So, my wife and I went there. Richard finally did come. He ended up, and I don't know what the history is behind this, but he ended up going to Sedona, Arizona, and spending like 3 months living in a tent with him and his family. And what's really sad is that as I look back on this, my brother had established himself in California and done relatively well. He joined the painters union. He was a superintendent for a union shop. He was able to buy a home in San Diego, and things were going well for him. And this message thing just completely uplifted his life. He sold everything, moved initially to Arizona for a few months, and then he came to Colorado. And I was so happy that he was there, and he started attending Southworth Church too.
The cult has so far dumbed down all of the things that you and I knew and experienced in the message. That's the other reason I'm glad to have you on here to talk through this, because I grew up in the old message before they changed it. And
Right.
California sinking was a thing. It was a big thing.
Right.
It was
Huge.
It was imminent, right? And you mentioned Billy Paul, who is, so well respected in the message that I grew up in, that's why they called them special meetings. When he would go and he would preach
right.
these things, they were called special meetings, right? And every single one that I attended, and I attended several of them, he would say, "I'm not an old man yet, because before I'm an old man, this thing's supposed to sink." And now that he's dead and gone, we have all of these people saying, "No." What was the latest one I heard? They had a fish tank in the building where they were
I heard you said that. It's like
come on, man. That's not the message that I grew up in, right?
Right.
Well, before the message that I grew up in, it was 1977 was the big thing. And I know several people, like you mentioned, that upended their lives. They had one guy I was talking to his father had a very successful business. He would have been heir to that business. And now, he's not struggling, but he's nowhere near what he would be if they had have continued that. And then on the flip side, you had all of these people who, because the world's about to end and you don't need your money, well, let's all give it to the church. Well, what do the church need it for, right? If the world is ending, they don't need it either. But,
so true. Yeah, exactly, right?
Right. So but they wanted to pass the money basket because the world's about to end, so give me your money. And when you take a step back, this whole thing is just so foolish.
I know. It really is foolish. And it's just so sad how it devastated people's lives over time. So anyway, Richard finally moved back. And what's interesting is that the itinerant preacher that convinced him of the message, he ended up staying in California. Now, he felt that his calling was to, just like he did with my brother, infiltrate these churches and try to convince people to leave. So he felt like he was like on a sinking ship trying to get people into the lifeboats to leave California. So we actually didn't really hear from him after that. And I don't know what happened to him. Like I said, that was 50 years ago and he was in his 60s. So I'm sure he's been long gone since then. So we start as a family, my brother and his family and me, and Southworth ended up, my wife and I graduated. And, we changed a lot of our life plans too because of the message. We could have gone on to college, but because education was demonized, I'm just so thankful that nobody convinced us to leave high school. Because, I know a lot of people who they took their kids out of school and they ended up not getting educated at all, or getting a very poor education being homeschooled. So we graduated from high school and we literally got married a week after high school.
Wow.
And my feeling was that, hey, the Lord's coming in 1977. I want to get married and maybe have a kid, right? So we did. We had a kid. We had our first kid in 1977. And I said, well, and then after that, man, it's over, right? So as I look back, my wife and I have talked about this quite a bit, and I've shared this with my children. What attracted us to the message initially? And we both come from somewhat dysfunctional families. And, my wife's father was an alcoholic. He was very abusive. My mom's issues with drug addiction. Neither one of us had a really tight, firm family structure to support us. And that's what we were looking for. And the fact that it was my own brother who brought me into this kind of reinforced the whole idea of my family with my brother, and also this new message family that I was now a part of. It was like something that I had that I'd never really had before. And it was, ultimately it was fake, but it was meeting that particular need for us. So one of the things I noticed about Southworth was he'd always talk about in these almost like riddles about a deeper knowledge or a deeper sense of the message. And come to find out, he was a return ministry preacher, right? He believed that Branham was going to come back and shoot the bear and have a tent revival and all these things. And I thought that was just ridiculous, and I was just a kid.
That's
now,
my
initially,
sect.
right?
That's my sect. That's the one that I came from.
Is it really? Did you were return ministry? Wow.
My grandfather and Billy Paul and Perry Green were the ones who spread that the heaviest. And
Wow. Wow.
I've come to the conclusion that it was literally a means to keep the cult from imploding whenever he died in 1965, because
Exactly
instead
right.
of having everybody focus on the dead guy that's in the casket, they can focus on, well, he's going to rise up at Easter, so let's
Right.
have the burial at
Just
Easter.
crazy, right?
Takes their
Yeah,
mind
for
off
sure.
of it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Have you ever wondered how the Pentecostal movement started, or how the progression of modern Pentecostalism transitioned through the latter rain, charismatic, and other fringe movements into the New Apostolic Reformation? You can learn this and more on William Branham Historical Research's website, william-branham.org. On the books page of the website, you can find the compiled research of John Collins, Charles Paisley, Stephen Montgomery, John McKinnon, and others, with links to the paper, audio, and digital versions of each book. You can also find resources and documentation on various people and topics related to those movements. If you want to contribute to the cause, you can support the podcast by clicking the Contribute button at the top. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe to the audio or video version that you're listening to or watching. On behalf of William Branham Historical Research, we want to thank you for your support.
So I rejected it, and I said there has to be another explanation for these prophecies that weren't fulfilled. Richard initially accepted it, but he actually came around very quickly to recognizing that it was false. So, I had left that Southwest church. I couldn't go anymore. And then my brother left shortly after I did. So what we started doing was we started meeting in, my wife and I were renting a home from her mom and her stepdad. And we had a basement that was partially finished. So we started meeting in the basement. So my family, his family, and the people that we had both brought in, we were both, I felt like I was called to preach. Later on when I realized that my calling was very different, I became a public speaker. But at the time I thought that, I had a religious calling. So I had brought in some of my friends, and he had people. So we had probably, 12, 13 people in this basement that we were, and initially we just listened to Branham's tapes, and then we would discuss them. So, but in the meantime, remember my friend I told you that I met in Southwest Church? He went back. He moved back to the Midwest, this church, and this was, I don't know if you've encountered this, John, in your experiences with message churches, but I call this church Message Light, right? So one of the things that I really had trouble with was the belief that they believed that Branham's words were inerrant, just like the Bible. And at the time, I believed that the Bible's words were inerrant. So I was like, how could you put Branham's words on the same par as the Bible? That didn't make any sense to me. I said he was human, he was fallible, but there was the belief that, he was the prophet of God, so everything he said was perfect. And the things that bothered me the most was, and this never sat right with me, the racist statements he made, and some of the really, really damning statements he made about women.
Oh yeah.
I still bought into the patriarchy, the thing about man being over a woman and all of that. I bought into that back then, but I just thought that his perception was so harsh towards women. So it was really hard for me to accept his words as inerrant. Now, this other church, this I call the Message Light Church, they did not believe that Branham's words were inerrant, right? So I thought, well, hey, I think maybe I found my people here, right? And they weren't nearly as strict. So they allowed women to trim their hair. I didn't see any women like with bangs and stuff like that, but they would trim their hair. They were allowed to wear a little bit of makeup if they had blemishes or whatever to cover stuff up. I don't think they were strict about the dress, how long their dresses had to be. I think maybe just a little, just like at knee level was considered okay. I know there's some message cults that they were like against women wearing sandals and stuff like that. And it was okay in this church. And they weren't as enamored with they believed him to be a prophet still, the fulfillment of Malachi 4 and all of that. But the pastor spent a lot of time, and it was more like these. I would say it's very similar to a lot of the churches now, where he just talked about being a Christian and living, being a good Christian and what that meant, and referring periodically to the end times and all that. But there wasn't as much of a emphasis on that. So my wife and I got connected with that church because it's, and I'll get to this here in a moment. We eventually ended up parting ways with my brother. So, but I was with my brother, and we're also listening to tapes, and we took vacation, at least 2 vacations out to this Midwest church. Well, my brother was very offended that we were going there because he felt like this pastor was totally off the mark, right? And he even accused me at one point he used the term whoring after this man's ministry. And my brother had gotten hooked up with the Martin brothers. Do you remember them?
I do.
Out of Arkansas. Were they out of Arkansas?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. He got very hooked up with them. And I remember telling him, I said, well, couldn't I say the same thing about you and them, the Martin brothers, that you're whoring after their ministry? I said, you just like them for some reason, and I like this guy's ministry. Why did we have to call it that? So at one point, what had happened was, and you remember this church was a lot more liberal in their perspective of a woman's role and so on. So in my house, and this is still the case, my wife handles the finances. I've just been never very good at that. She pays the bills and does all this. So we were demonized because they felt that was a man's role to do that. So at one point, we were on the verge of leaving, and my brother ended up becoming the pastor. And I don't even remember how exactly that happened of our little group. And a couple of men that I brought in, young men, they ended up becoming his deacons. And at one point they came over to our house, and they confronted me, the fact that I was not living in God's will because I was allowing my wife to take care of our finances, right? So I pushed back. I said, look, all right, number one, show me scripture where that's wrong, or show me a quote that Branham said that's wrong. And they couldn't. They just said, well, she's usurping authority over men. I said, I still have authority over it. I'm just delegating it to her, right? And that was my perception back then. I mean, now we were totally even in how we see our relationship. But at that point, but they couldn't prove anything to me. And I think I even remember talking about Proverbs 31 about the virtuous woman and buying land. And it's like, this woman did stuff. You know, this woman that the Bible exemplifies as a good woman, she had authority and she did things out in the world, you know?
Yeah. So
anyway, that was for my wife and I, that was final draw. We're just like, we're done. We were just in. At that point, I severed my relationship with my brother. And then we started getting more involved in this other church.
Yeah. I don't know if you remember the old Little Rascal show, but I had this conversation.
Yeah, of course, right.
I had this conversation when we first left the message and began to realize the different splinter groups of, how each one developed differently. And I made the joke, and it's actually less of a joke now that I know how it works, but it was like each church with their own He-Man's Woman Haters Club, because whatever was the thing that the men could do to feel superior to the women, that became doctrine. And like you said, half the time you couldn't even find it in Branham's ministry. You couldn't find it in Pentecostalism. Right. You couldn't find it in the Bible, obviously. But it was a He-Man's Woman Haters Club. And, growing up, I went to churches from South Carolina to Arizona, everywhere in between. Mm-hmm. So I got to see some of the more liberal churches like you're describing. And I think I may have heard the term whoring after those, but we felt like they weren't part of the message because they did not follow all of the cult rules, basically. Right. And then this created this bigger problem for me because I'd go to one church that I was told did follow the cult rules, and then we'd go to another church that quote unquote did follow the cult rules, but their rules were different. And so I'm trying to reconcile in my head, well, why can you do this in this church and not this other thing in this other church? And they're both, every one of them is different, and it literally come down to whatever was the He-Man Woman Haters Club agenda of that church.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And what's so sad, John, is that in all of these cults, and not just the message cults, I think cults, even if they're non-Christian cults, women seem to take the brunt of it. It's like patriarchy has infused in all of it. And it's just so incredibly sad. The stories I hear about people who've come out of the message and other types of cults, the damage that's been done to women is especially hard. And it's just so sad that it happens that way. You know,
Yeah.
I know hearing stories of women for such petty little things being called whores. And it's devastating. It's so devastating. So, John, you remember I mentioned I had two brothers? So my brother Richard, who was 16 years older than I was, he's the one who got us all involved and originally in Christianity and then in the cult. And then I had my middle brother, who was 11 years older than me. And he and his wife also got involved in the cult. And he became very disillusioned with my brother because he could see the authoritarianism coming in to the ministry. And so he left, but his wife did not. His wife ended up staying. So he and his wife split up. So he went his own direction. And my wife and I still tried to stay. We stayed in the message, but this Message Light Church. My brother Danny, I guess you would say using their terminology, he backslid. He went back into not being a Christian anymore. And I will revisit Danny here later on as to what happened with him. But as we were attending this Message Light Church, we were getting tapes from the ministry, from the pastor there, and they instituted, according to what Branham had taught, a gift room, right? So where people would have prophecy, and it was mostly women in the gift room. And now, now that I started to realize this, most of what came out of the gift room was basically what the pastor and the ministry wanted, but is being filtered through the so-called prophecies.
Yes.
So, yeah, you're probably familiar with that too.
I am. In fact, one of the Weird Doctrines episodes, we covered a woman who is quote unquote speaking in tongues, but she's literally just scolding the people as if God is scolding the people through them.
Yeah, it's sad.
But
anyway, a prophecy came out of the gift room that my wife and I were supposed to move to Wisconsin now, because that was supposed to be where God wanted us, right? So I was really perplexed. It's like, well, you know what? If God wanted us there, why didn't He tell us? Why did He go this route? So, but we were fixing on moving to Wisconsin, to this Midwestern church, and so what happened was this young man that I was friends with, he was moving out as well, and so we ended up putting a lot of our furniture, sending it out there to Wisconsin, and so we sent it out there. And at the time, I had a temporary position. I was still working as a painter at the point. And my brother Danny got me a job at a university working as a painter, but it was temporary. But what happened is that they were going to have a full-time position come open. So I decided to apply for it. And when I told the pastor and other people, they said, why would you even bother doing that? Because God doesn't want you there anymore. God wants you up here. So I went ahead and applied anyway, and I ended up getting the job, which is interesting because now I ended up spending 40 years or 30 years in state government. It ended up being my career. But at the time, I had no clue that's where my life was headed. But I started having questions about that too, because one of the things they believed in was they believed that their ministry superseded that of Branham's. So the way they framed it was that Branham was sent as a prophet, and to give the bride right teachings, but he was not an apostle, so he really didn't have the authority to establish churches.
Yeah.
But guess who was given the authority to establish churches?
The pastor.
Right? This other ministry, right? So and I remember even hearing him, and I don't remember the exact reference, but there's another scripture in Revelation about 3 angels somewhere, about him kind of alluding to the fact that his ministry was one of those angels. And he was very brilliant man, but it was like, okay, this is really getting out of hand. I was starting to question Branham totally. And it's like, we just decided we're done with the whole thing. So I ended up going to Wisconsin, getting a plane ticket, going there, renting a truck. And I didn't talk to the pastor directly, and I don't know why I didn't. Could have just been fear on my part. But I talked to some other people. I talked to my friend, and I said, we're not moving. We're just going to stay where we're at. I don't know what we're going to do, but we're just going to stay where we're at because I don't feel good about any of this. So we ended up severing ties there too. So then we were just kind of like on our own, right? I still wanted to be a Christian at the time, and we tried to go to other churches, but it just didn't. Nothing really seemed to fit. So I've always been, since I'd become a Christian, I'd always been an avid reader, right? When Richard would send me before the message, the Kenneth Hagin and the Derek Prince, all those kinds I just devoured them. And then I devoured message books and the tapes and the transcripts. I just devoured all of it. And I think that's one of the reasons I started to see where a lot of people who don't really get into it, they started to see the inconsistencies and the discrepancies and the strange, crazy stuff that Branham said. So I needed to find a way out of this, So I found some really some positive Christian influences. I started reading Watchman Nee. Have you heard of Watchman Nee?
I have not.
So Watchman Nee was a Christian in China who was persecuted by the communist Christians, and he wrote prolifically, right? And it really grounded me just in some basic Christian understanding of grace, and it helped me get my theology straightened out. And Watchman Nee probably wrote several dozen books, right? So I got very interested in that. But then, all right, then this is you're going to find this really interesting. So Watchman Nee had a disciple by the name of Witness Lee, right? Another Chinese gentleman. And their whole thing was that there's only one church in a city. They called it the local church. So they established this ministry. And Watchman Nee ended up dying in China, but Witness Lee ended up taking this ministry and using a lot of Watchman Nee's teachings and creating another cult out of this. And the whole premise, it was a much kinder, gentler cult than the message. They didn't have all the rules about, how women should dress and all that. I mean, they had some, but not nearly as strict. But they did believe that the church was localized, and they call themselves the church that was in Denver or the church that was in San Diego, or whatever it happened to be. So I tried that. I said, well, you know what? I'm going to check this out. So I checked it out, and I realized this is a lot better than the message, but it still sucks. It's still cultic in some capacity. And I ended up meeting a guy there who also, he had been an elder there in the church, and he started to see the discrepancies. So we became friends. He was older than me. So, I was in my mid-20s. He was probably in his mid-30s. And we became friends. And I told him about my experience with the message. He told me about his experience with the local church. And he ended up leaving the local church. Well, we only went to maybe a couple services. And he said, I'm going to start a Bible study for people who have been hurt by toxic religion. So he started this Bible study, and he invited me to be a part of it. And I thought, wow, this is great. So the very first Bible study he had, I went to, and he had been an elder and a teacher, and he knew the Bible really well. He was very good, and I really had a really good experience at this Bible study. Well, do you remember me talking about my brother Danny? What had happened?
Yeah.
So I'd only gone to this Bible study once, right? And it was April 11th. And this is how powerful of what I'm going to share with you, the impact it had on me. April 11th, 1985. I came home that night, and the way my wife and I did, when I would check out a church, my wife didn't like. I was the scout. I would go and check out a church or Bible study, and if I liked it, I'd say, this was pretty good, we should check it out. And then she would come with me. She didn't like to go, and just because it was like just too much because of everything we'd experienced with the message and so on. So I came back from the Bible study, and I was pretty happy, and I thought, well, maybe this is the path we're going to go. And my wife met me at the door, and she just looked so downtrodden. And I go, what's wrong, honey? What's wrong? And she said, they found Danny. I said, what do you mean? They said, Danny died. And I said, he was only 37. And I said, oh my God. And everything, my heart just sunk. Because 12 years later, I had lost my mom now, and my brother's only 37. I said, what happened? And this was the thing that really floored me. She said, they think he was murdered. Wow. So that completely upended my life. It upended my other brother Richard's life. My dad, of course, losing his son to and he was murdered. And what had happened was that so he had split up with his wife. He had a so-called friend, that he rented an apartment that was next to his, and they had been on the outs. They had gotten into some disagreements, and they had gotten into a fight. And my brother was a big man. My brother Danny, he was a bodybuilder, and he was a big man, kind of intimidating. And apparently my brother had gotten the better of this other man in this fight, and this other man went back to his room. They were like in the laundry room, and he got 2 guns, and he shot my brother.
It's awful.
So, yeah, horrible. So for a very short time, this horrible experience brought my family together again. So we ended up coming together in my house, which was kind of centrally located, just to try to figure out what was going on. We kind of figured out right away that it was his room, that was his so-called friend that lived in the same apartment complex that he lived in, and it took about 18 months for, I don't remember if the man turned himself in or if he was caught, but they eventually found him, and he went to trial, and the murder trial came up. And I'll tell you, John, that was probably one of the hardest things my family's ever had to experience, was going through this murder trial. And for me personally, it was the time where I realized that I had lost 2 brothers. I had lost one through a murder and one through a cult. And what had happened was through the course. So up to that point, the family was joined together to try to figure out what happened to Danny, and also joined together just in our grief for what had happened. So, but by the time the murder trial rolled along, and we were in the thick of it, I was used as a character witness by the district attorney, so I was able to see everything that happened. And one of the tactics that the defense uses is to try to make the victim look bad. So they did everything in their power. And my brother Danny did have some things that he had done that were very unsavory, and things that but he didn't deserve to be killed for any of that. So what had happened was, to make a long story short, this whole murder trial, at the very end, a lot of people from my brother's church had come to support my brother, to support all of us. And they were talking religious talk, message talk. And there was a lot of talk about how this man needed to be, the man that killed my brother, how he needed to be executed, and that he should go to hell and pay for what he did. And, I wanted him to be punished too, but I just felt like there was so much hatred and vehemence. And then talking about the prophet, all these other things that is part and parcel of the message. I just remember at one point he was telling me something, and I don't even remember what he was telling me, but I remember I did not agree with any of it. And I just looked at him and said, "Richard, I love you, but I don't agree with you on any of this stuff anymore." And I remember him looking at me and not saying anything and just walking away. And at that point, that was the point I realized I lost 2 brothers at that point. One forever, and the other one, I had no clue. So at that point, our relationship, my relationship with my brother Richard, pretty much was severed for quite some time. Now, things did start to get better eventually, but it took about 10 years for it to happen. And one of the reasons I did want to share my story here on your podcast was that just to maybe give people hope that things can get better. They may not with family, but eventually we started calling each other. We didn't see each other very much, and I don't remember the impetus for all of this, but the thing that I've realized too is that we all have complicated legacies. We've all done things that are great and things are not so great, and that's including the people that influenced us in the cult. And when I talk, and then this I know this frustrates my members of my family when I call my brother a cult pastor. That doesn't mean I don't think he was in many ways a good man, that he had parts of himself that were incredible, that he did some good things for a lot of people. But there's that other side too, the side that was damaged a lot of people, that hurt a lot of families. And we need to be able to hold both those perspectives when we see. And when at some point when I'm gone and when you're gone, we're going to have these legacies too that people are going to have to recognize. Hopefully, the things we've done the good things we've done will outweigh the other things we've done. But, we've all have these complicated legacies. So when we can see, I was able to see my brother through a different lens and not just demonize him because he had his own reasons for getting involved in the message. And it takes a lot of courage to leave something like that. And even though I think he saw some of the inconsistencies, he had risen to a point where he was over a lot of people. He had how difficult. I was just at that point just a low-level believer. And even as hard as it was for me to leave, I can't imagine somebody in the position of being a pastor coming to the congregation and say, hey, this guy Branham, Brother Branham, I not only think he was not a prophet, I think he was a con man and all these other things, all the stuff that you've been able to uncover in your research. That's really difficult. It takes so much courage to do that.
It's hard to admit you're wrong.
Yeah, it's incredibly hard. And so now in my life now as a leadership facilitator and coach, I've one of the things I've been able to do is really get into how people develop, how people grow and mature. It used to be up until like the 1970s, most psychologists believed that once you hit your early 20s, that you just stopped growing emotionally and intellectually. It's like you were done. But they've since that point, a lot of some incredible theorists, psychologists, and so on have realized, no, that's not the case. That we can continue to grow. Not everybody does, obviously, but we can continue to grow for our entire lives. And one of the things I learned this actually from an author by the name of Nick Petrie, who studies leadership development. He says there are three things that it takes to grow to the next level of our development. The first one is heat experiences. These are difficult things that we go through. The second one is colliding perspectives. So in order for us to change our mind, we need to have input from other sources. And this is one of the reasons cults keep those resources away from people. They don't want people to see different perspectives. They want people just to hear what they're saying, whatever that message happens to be. Because when people hear other perspectives, then the possibility becomes that they might change their mind and see something different. So, and the last one is then that it's called elevated sense making. So the heat experiences are those experiences where you say, this stuff that I'm seeing just doesn't make sense. You find other resources, you get different perspectives, and then you start to make your paradigm completely changes. You have an elevated sense of sense making.
They do not want you to learn anything that is logical or anything that could cause you to explore the critical thought. Critical thinking is suppressed.
Right. Exactly.
But one of the weird things that I've learned is that when you're in these cults, they don't even allow you to do many of the self-help studies and courses and self-help books. They don't want you to better yourself.
Right. They really don't. They want to keep you subjected to them. It's a form of patriarchy. It really is. And authoritarian. It's power over is what it is. Another. It's funny. I'm not Catholic. I never went back to the Catholic Church, but I do admire some Catholic teachers. One is a guy by the name of Richard Rohr, and he's a Franciscan Christian mystic. And one of the things he said was that the only reason people really change is either two things: great pain or great love. And I think it's both. That when you're in the message and you're dealing with this great pain, that things aren't making sense, you have to love the truth enough to make the courageous steps, to make the decisions, to do what you have to do, to leave, to confront the authority, to do whatever it is. You have to love the truth enough. You have to love yourself enough. You have to love your own family enough to be able to make those decisions. And it was some of the hardest things I've ever done was making these decisions because I looked up to my brother. He was an early mentor. And I still believed that my brother cared for me, that he still loved me, but he had a warped perception of what that meant. There's another saying, and this is in the business world, but the saying is that if you put a good person in a bad system, the system wins every time. And that was related to organizations, but I think the same thing applies to any system. especially churches. You know, you put good people in these bad systems, and the system wins out every time.
Yeah, that is a terrible, heartbreaking story. What happened between you and your brother after all of this?
So once that, you know, when I shared that we had that confrontation right after the murder trial in the court, and that wasn't in the courtroom, it was in the hallway of the courtroom. We were on the heretic list for probably about 10 years, where we pretty much had no or very little interaction with my brother. And my dad, remember my dad's here too, right? He never had gotten involved. And my brother Richard demonized my dad, not so much because he didn't accept the message, because he never really got involved in any of the religious stuff. He was kind of like a bystander. When my mom died, my dad started dating again, right? And he had lots of girlfriends. He had that I call it the Leyba charm. You know, he had a lot of girlfriends, and my brother didn't think that was right, so he demonized my dad for his lifestyle. So my dad was pretty upset about that Richard was demonizing it for that. So at that point, the only family that I had connection to was my dad, right? So eventually, though, my brother did come around, and he did come around to the point where he realized that the way he was treating my father was inappropriate. So he went to my dad and he apologized to my dad. And he started talking to my dad, and my dad actually started going to the church. Now, my dad was a funny guy. He never believed any of it, but he wanted to be a part of Richard's life, so he would go to church, right? And then my dad also, and he said, plus they take me to lunch afterwards. So he'd go to church with my brother, and he told me about my brother apologizing to him. And my dad asked me, he said, did he ever apologize to you for the way he treated you? I said, no. So my dad had three things that upset him about my brother that he never told him. I wish he would have talked to him about this, but my dad was very passive, even passive aggressive in some ways. A good man, kind man, gentle man, but he was very conflict avoidant. The first one was that he apologized to my dad, but he never apologized to me. The second one was he didn't like the way he treated his wife. My brother's wife was named Dorothy. Dorothy was one of the kindest, sweetest women you'd ever want to meet. A very devout message follower. And my brother was very harsh with her in a lot of ways, just like a lot of message men are. I know he loved his wife very deeply, but still, Dorothy, get me this. Dorothy, do that. So that was the second thing. And the third thing, and my dad saw through a lot of the cult influences, even though he may not have had the frame of reference that we do to look at it. He said, I don't like the way he treats his church. He says he snaps his fingers and those people come running. And he saw the authoritarianism that was there in the church. So my dad had a lot of repressed anger, and my dad eventually passed away in 2003. Somewhat, even though my brother did try, my dad did not have I don't know if he didn't have the skill or the fortitude to really talk to my brother about these things. But he died somewhat alienated from my brother. But thankfully, the last week or so before he died, it was my wife who was able to talk to him about his anger issues towards my brother. So in his heart, he started to make amends. He never talked to my brother. I wish he would have. And after my dad died, I never shared with my brother the reasons that my dad had animosity toward him. Now that I look back, I wonder if I made a mistake, if maybe I should have, but I felt like that was not my story to tell. So I never did share that with my brother. So my dad passed away in 2003. And we both talked about, now it's just me and my brother Richard. We're the only ones left. We talked about maybe getting together, and at that point, up until my dad, towards the latter years of my dad's life, we were starting to do more things together as a family. We visited the church. They did a special thing for my dad for his birthday or something, and we visited the church. And we were able to talk even a little bit about religion. My brother had said that God had told him that he and his wife would be alive when the rapture happened, right? So and now I've since learned that the rapture is a doctrine that wasn't even original to the church, that it came in later, and I think it's a silly doctrine. But very very much people believed it. I believed it at one point too, and I didn't push back. I just said, well, I thought the Bible said that no man knows the day or the hour. And he said, yeah, but I'm not saying I know when it's going to happen. I just know that we're going to be alive when it happens. I said, well, okay. And then I would joke, and we both had a good sense of humor. I said, so when the rapture happens, can I have your stuff? And he laughs. He says, sure, I'm not going to need it, right? Well, what had happened then later was that his wife, this was after my father died, his wife started getting ill. And eventually, she started having these mobility issues. She came down with ALS. And she's the first person I've ever known that has ever gotten that disease. But I'd read about it, and I read how devastating it was, and it was incredibly devastating. So she eventually passed away, and I think this was like 2013. And I think what happened with my brother was he started to be confronted with the fallacy of his thinking. Well, there goes that, right? That Dorothy's not going to make the rapture now because she died. The other thing he told me when she got it, she said, I know for sure God's going to heal her. She's going to get over all this, and God's going to heal her. And I remember talking to him and saying, Richard, I hope you're right. I hope God does heal her. But obviously that never happened. So she passed away, and for several months before she passed away, my wife and I were trying to go to see her. And my brother kept giving me excuses, well, now's not a good time, or she's not feeling good, or whatever. And it wasn't until the graciousness of another family member who called and said, if you want to see Dorothy, you're going to have to come because she's on her last days. So we finally got to see her. And what was so sad was just not just seeing her, but my brother was so defeated at that point in his life. His own health had started failing drastically. So he had stepped away from ministry. He was still officially the pastor, but other men had taken up the slack. He wasn't really preaching much anymore. He was morbidly obese, very, very heavy. Like I even don't even want to guess how big he was, but very, very heavy. Had all sorts of health problems. And it's just like his life was starting to fall apart. It was so incredibly sad. So Dorothy passed away, and it was so heartbreaking for him. Because even though they still had that patriarchal message kind of relationship, I really do believe they loved each other very, very deeply. Very, very deeply. So he was devastated. And what had happened, I didn't mention this, but a few years prior to that, his oldest daughter had committed suicide. And she had left the message early, and she was put out from under the blood. And I don't know if my wife and I were ever put out from under the blood, but I know she was, because we had heard that had happened. She had ended up getting into drugs, and she wasn't young when she took her life. She's like 45 and had a family. But and the sad thing that one of the things that grieves me is that because we left the message fairly early, we never really got to see his kids grow up, and he didn't get to see my kids grow up, and so there was that disconnection. And after his daughter committed suicide, I remember talking to my brother, and I wish I had talked to his daughter a couple of times on the phone, but we didn't really have much of a relationship. And my brother and I kind of had this unspoken rule that he wouldn't try to influence my children to try to go to the message, and I wouldn't try to influence his children in whatever it is I happen to believe in, right? But I said, I wish I could have talked to her, because I had struggled with severe depression in my life at times, and had even had suicidal ideation. And I said, I wish I could have talked to her, and maybe I could have helped her. So that had happened in between the death of, he lost his daughter, and now he's lost his wife, right? So 2 years later, Richard passes away in 2015. I talked to him a few times between the death of his wife and the time he died, and there was a part of Richard that I think in some ways maybe only I saw. The part of him that was pre-message, that that the part of him that where he was still my big brother, that he really loved me and that I really loved him. And it was like, apart from all of the toxic influences of religion and the cult and all these things, I felt like I was able to reach a little bit of part of him in that. And that's the part I want to remember about him. And you're going to find this really interesting, John, and I'm kind of saving this part for last, but you remember my brother Danny, right? So after Danny had left the church, he was a painter. Sometimes we'd work on projects together. My brother Danny was not a very spiritual person. He wasn't one to dreams or talk about prophecy or anything of that sort. He told me about a dream he had. And even sharing this, I don't want it to make it seem like, I am putting more on this than possible. But I think it's kind of profound, at least for me. He had a dream that this skeleton in a cowboy outfit was riding a horse and was asking for my brother Richard. And Danny said in the dream he felt like to kill him. And my brother Danny said, no, you can't have him, take me instead. And this was even after my brother Danny was very alienated from my brother Richard. And we had no clue what that meant, right? And then shortly later, my brother passed away. And my brother died. He was murdered on April 11th, 1985. 30 years to the day, on April 11th, 2015, my other brother dies from natural causes.
Wow. Such a tragic story, and I can't even imagine going through some of the things that you went through. It's hard for all of us. Obviously, when you leave a cult, people say it's the most difficult time of your life leaving. But then, on top of all of that, you had things that were even far more difficult than leaving the cult. If you could go back in time and say something to your former self while you were in this, or to your brothers, to your family, what would you say to yourself?
Well, John, that's a really good question, because when you're going through it, you can't really see the end of it. And you don't know what your life's going to be down the road. You make these decisions to cut off relationships, to do what you think is right, and you don't know what's going to happen. But I guess what I would tell my younger self is that I did make the right choice, that it was worth it. The pain that I was going through would be worth it in the long run for my children, my children's children. Because, John, you and I, we are cycle breakers. We made the decision that we and our families and our future generations are not going to have to go through this, because we made those hard decisions to do that. The other day, I had posted something on Facebook about toxic religion, and some people had commented, and I made a comment. I said, toxic religion almost destroyed my family. And I'm going to get a little teared up here. My oldest son, who's 47. Now, my kids didn't really experience much of the message. Probably my oldest son the most. He was very small when we left. But he came back on, and he posted, and this is what he said. His name's Mark as well. He said, I'm so glad it didn't destroy our whole family. Your family is here and loves and appreciates you and Mom more than anything. The strength it took you both to leave that toxic environment, even though it meant losing some dear family connections, has made all the difference for your children and everyone that comes after us. You did a good thing.
It's so hard, Mark. I can't even imagine. Like, I'm struggling myself not to cry. It's thinking of all of the many things that you had to go through, and on top of that, experiencing the cult and experiencing different cultish groups that were even levels beyond what I grew up with. Can't even imagine, but I am so happy that you're out. Like I said, we've known each other for many years now, and it's been...
I know, right?
Yeah, it's been great just knowing you and talking to you through the
you too, John.
groups.
It's an honor to know you. And let me know if there's anything I can do to help you in your cause with, X-message believer stuff. I mean, I'd be willing to do anything I can to help out.
I appreciate it. Well, if you've enjoyed our show and you want more information, you can check us out on the web. You can find us at william-branham.org. For an overview of the historical research of William Branham and the healing revivals, Read Preacher Behind the White Hoods, a critical examination of William Branham and his message. Available on Amazon, Kindle, and Audible.